Focus here is economic growth, Black political representation, with a look at data. At the end of this session, you want to be able to define these terms that are listed here. Continue to use the source worksheet, and then we're going to be using the term sheet as well as this data sheet because we're going to be looking at data. We're going to continue using the definition sheet, and then we're going to add this data sheet to come up with a conclusion about each chart. Starting off with the Black middle class. And if you do not remember from Unit 3, we talked about Madam C.J. Walker. We'll be talking about a couple of other Black entrepreneurs, as well as the Black middle class. So on this slide, we have some of the graphs that we'll be looking at in greater detail later. And we're going to focus on the gap between white and Black communities. Remember, in prior class, we talked about generation wealth, where your ability to transfer a home and or other assets to your family members. But as a result of segregation and other institutional policies, the ability to transfer wealth for African Americans is not the same. As we could see here with this statistic in 2016, wealth for Black families at $17,000 compared to $171 for white families. We're also going to transition to educational opportunities. One of the things that the AP framework stresses is that urbanization increased an opportunity for employment and the growth of Black businesses. Here are two examples. Daymond John, who created the clothing line FUBU, which stands for Us, By Us. He is also a regular on the show Shark Tank. In this clip here, you'll see some of his work on that particular series. Another entrepreneur in the record business, Russell Simmons, one of the founders of the record label Def Jam. They also made a movie about him in the 1980s called Krush Groove. Another example of urbanization leading to the growth of Black business would be the low-life culture. And the low-life culture is actually a sad story where Black and Latino youths in the 1980s would desire to wear luxury brands, however they could not afford such items, and as a result they started to steal these items from department stores. Here we see the co-founder of the organization Low Life Thurston Howell, as well as Rack Low, and it indicates here when he was about 9 or 10 years old how good he felt just to be able to wear such clothing. If you were to click this link, you would see the Low Life brand, how they in recent times have been able to market and sell their own clothing line. Another individual could be Dapper Dan, as a Black entrepreneur, is an example of urbanization. And a story of Dapper Dan is once again a story of race, as it says here. He found it difficult to get certain textiles and furs he needed as a result of his race and location. And as a good entrepreneur, he realized that Louis Vuitton and Gucci, they were making bags, wallets, and luggage, and he took some of their leather and decided that he was going to start making clothing out of it. Here we see an image of his famous jacket for Diane Dixon. Separate from the middle class and Black entrepreneurs, we're going to transition to political gains. I want to go back to that Voting Rights Act of 1965 because the outcome is going to lead to more voting among the Black community. And then you see some elected officials emerging: Shirley Chisholm, Colin Powell, and Condoleezza Rice. Here we see the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was designed to deal with all of the state voting laws that existed. In this political cartoon, we see the individual trying to vote and having to pass the literacy test, the poll tax, the grandfather clause, as well as violence from the Klan, whereas this individual is just easily able to vote, which is primarily the reason why the federal government needed a Voting Rights Act in '65. Another example of local, state versus federal government that we have addressed previously in this course. Here we see our first data point, and it's about eligible voters among Black Americans, and we see that it's increasing. This link right here, you want to see the impact on the 2020 election. That is a news clip. And remember, we want to use this chart, and we're going to put the chart description, which is this information here. And then you want to just analyze however you see and interpret this data. Here we have a historic black voter registration for the years 1940 to 1970. And we can see the upward trend in that Civil Rights Act 1965. Right here, we see that it's increasing. So we want to place source number 2 and analyze the data. As you see, and come up with a conclusion. Shirley Chisholm, one of the required names in the AP framework, first black woman elected to Congress in 1968. For that year, that definitely is a success. And in 1971, she established the Congressional Black Caucus. I've placed a definition for a caucus here. And if you have no idea how that works, let's just say you have 100 politicians, but 30 are going to caucus together. That means that these 30 are guaranteed votes on that particular issue. Colin Powell gained national attention after Desert Storm in the early 90s. And then in 2001, he was appointed by Bush to be the first black Secretary of State. Here he is at the United Nations trying to argue the U.S. case for Saddam Hussein in Iraq having weapons of mass destruction after 9/11. By clicking this link, you could hear his presentation. Another required source for the AP framework is Colin Powell's address at Howard University. Condoleezza Rice succeeded Colin Powell as Secretary of State to become the first black woman to hold the position. By clicking this link, you can see a video clip of her being sworn in as Secretary of State in 2005. Here we have another required image from the AP framework, this portrait of Barack Obama, first black president in 2008. By clicking this link, you could see image of Obama taking the oath of office, which reminded me of this episode of Blackish, season 2, episode 6, where the main character gives a speech about how he felt on that particular night. Another required image is this portrait of First Lady Michelle Obama, who was Barack Obama's wife. Also going to point out that she was raised on the south side of Chicago. Kamala Harris, the first female vice president under Joe Biden for the year 2020. We're going to make a transition to the data section. And again, you want to continue using this sheet here. You want to place the description of the chart and then just come up with a conclusion about the data. Our next source is a map of the United States, trying to identify where black middle-class families are isolated. Here I have another figure. This one's interesting because it's arguing here that while lower and middle class increases, which means as these two are starting to increase, you're noticing a black upper class decrease. For this slide, we see overrepresentation in office, transportation, healthcare, and then underrepresentation in these areas right here. Here to the left, you have a list of occupations. Here we have another graph, black middle class less likely to own homes. That doesn't mean that they're not in a home. That means that maybe they don't own it or they didn't pay it off, because traditionally it takes 30 years to pay off a loan. So if we take the year 1950, if we say in 1950, a nuclear family, man, woman, have a child, and by 1980 they pay off that home. It's taken them 30 years and now they pass away. Their ability to transfer this home to their child means that the child is going to be better off. But if they're in their 15th year of paying off that home, that could mean that they don't technically own the home, that the bank still owns it. Here we have some more data points tracing these issues here. Here we're looking at college degrees, black immigration, and those people who are identifying who are black and Hispanic, and how those numbers are starting to change. The unifying term black indicating a community shared African heritage. So we have looked at some of the labels for Black African American, and we're starting to see embracing the term Black for a common shared African heritage experience, as it mentions here. Here we see some changes with regard to religion. 2/3 African Americans identifying as Protestant, 20% not affiliated with any religion, which is a reversal of some of the history that we've looked at in this course. Black religious leaders, faith communities have played substantial roles in Black civil rights. We've addressed this during the civil rights movement as well as slavery, and the role of the Black church as a institution within the Black community, as it mentions down here. All of the contributing success of the Black church as a result of the African diaspora. This chart is looking at Black population living in the South since 1970s, and it's arguing that there is a slight increase in that particular shift, which would be a reversal of that Great Migration. Continuing with the trend of looking at where the Black population lives, according to this map from 2019, we still see Black people mostly living in the South. As it mentions here, 56% for the South. Definitely a reversal of that Great Migration. Here we see the top 5 states, and with the top 5 states, we see the population, and once again, the South coming in the top 3. But this chart adds single race, multiracial, and Black Hispanic, as it adds those numbers as well into these particular data points. Here we see the sharp increase since 2000 for both multiracial and Hispanic numbers. Using this graph here, Black, Hispanic, multiracial, and then single race. Here we have some education data, bachelor's degree, master's, and higher, and we see the slight upward trend for the degrees. Largest metropolitan area, urbanization. Notice once again, single race, multiracial, Black, Hispanic, and then they've identified Black Americans that are non-Hispanic within these two columns that are here. So we have New York, Atlanta, Washington, Chicago, Philadelphia. This chart looks at the upward trend for number of Black immigrants, but it's comparing African origin versus Caribbean origin, an issue that we have addressed in previous classes with regard to Caribbean immigration in the early 1900s. Here we have economic data, and with this data, we learned that half of Black households earned $50,000 or more in 2019. However, in comparison to the average for the U.S. median household, $68,000 in 2019, according to the Census Bureau. Population totals, single race, multiracial, Black, Hispanic. We have the years to the left and all numbers column. The Black middle class in comparison to the past. Here we have this chart here that traces white families in comparison to Black. And we're looking at the 1960s. And for the 1960s, we're a little over 10,000 in comparison to almost 30,000 for the year 1960. For urban America, African Americans, as a result of the lack of a middle class, would be subjected to living in government housing like Pruitt-Igoe. By clicking this link here, you could see a trailer for the documentary The Pruitt-Igoe Myth. Another famous government housing project would be Cabrini Green in Chicago. Another trailer for the documentary 70 Acres in Chicago. A top-down shot of Cabrini Green, and this is where the TV show Good Times is supposed to take place in. I'm also going to include a reference to the game Blacks and Whites. This was used as an educational tool, this board game that plays like Monopoly, and it was designed to educate people in the 1970s about race, white flight, redlining, and other zoning policies, as you could see, these two sections here, the suburban zone and the estate zone. In order for you to move into the estate zone, you have to have $1 million in assets if you are black. In the suburban zone, only whites may buy until one property is bought by a black. Until then, blacks pay no rent. As we come to the end of this particular video, as well as the course, we want to think once again about some of the people we learned about in this video, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and how that is very similar to the experience of the gift of Alvin White being introduced to the people that are mentioned in this particular reading that we have talked about in previous classes. We're also going to come back to these questions and have a discussion about these items after we analyze the data points. And if you want to verify the definitions, feel free to use this slide here.